Welcome to Islam, World Religion, Political and Military System, Part 3. This is Dawn once again, and we're moving from the doctrinal issues of Islam to the spread of Islam from Muhammad to the formation of the State of Israel. We're just going to briefly review some of the history beginning with Muhammad from Part 1, just because I think it's important that we are able to take that portion of our history and move into what we're going to talk about in Part 3. Muhammad's young life. In pre-Islamic Arabia, we had Jews and Christians, but most Meccans worshiped numerous gods and inanimate objects by going on pilgrimages and offering sacrifices. Muhammad was born in the year 570 AD in Mecca to an aristocratic family. He lost his father before his birth, his mother at 6, his grandfather shortly thereafter, and was finally raised by his uncle, the head of the Qurayshi clan. Muhammad's adulthood. When he was 25 years old, he married Khadija, 40, who owned a caravan business. About 610 AD, when Muhammad was about 40 years old, he believed the angel Jibril, or Gabriel, delivered to him the message that there was only one true God, Allah, and he began preaching in about 612, gaining just a few converts. He could neither read nor write, bolstering the Muslim belief in the miracle of the Quran. He recited his visions to his disciples, who wrote them down on various scraps of paper, wood, rocks, bones, etc., and or memorized them. The Quran, meaning the recitation, only came into existence after his death. The reaction to Muhammad. The Meccans were generally hostile. He fled in 622 on a flight called the Hijra with his 100 or so followers to Medina. The Muslim calendar is dated beginning with this event. Muhammad organized a small army, and through combat and diplomacy, he achieved stability among the tribes in Medina. He built a mosque and formed a government that set rules for all the areas of life: religious, economic, political, and social. Meanwhile, in Mecca, an army was put together to destroy Muhammad. They battled for 6 years until Muhammad finally prevailed, conquering Mecca. While Muhammad was still based in Medina, he turned his attention to the Jews to convert them, but he largely failed, so therefore he began to use force. In Mecca, Muhammad destroyed all the idols in the Kaaba, but kept the Kaaba, which is surrounded today by the Great Mosque. Muhammad extended his control over most of Arabia by treaty or force. He was a religious, governmental, and military leader enforcing the worship of Allah. Muhammad continued to live in Medina. He made his last pilgrimage to the Kaaba in 632 because he suddenly died 3 months later. By his death, Muhammad and his men had unified most of the Arabian Peninsula under Islam. Followers zealously spread this new faith, Islam, meaning submission, obedience, and sometimes we'll see peace and purity as meanings, across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Here's a picture of the Kaaba, the small little black cuboid structure in the center, a little high, and then we can see it surrounded by the Great Mosque in a picture that I presume was taken during the Hajj, because you'll see probably literally millions of people there, certainly tens of thousands. Early Muslim conquest. We touched on these earlier, but I'm going to talk about them in a little bit greater detail so we can fully understand where the Muslims were turned back. After Muhammad's death, many Islamic tribes revolted against Muslim rule, reverting to paganism. Therefore, an army was set by Abu Bakr, Muhammad's chief successor according to the Sunnis, to subdue them. Tribal Arabs united to a great degree under Islam. It's called Ummah Wahida. More about this later. This is a really interesting concept. Non-Muslims were severely restricted to dhimmi status. We'll talk about this more later also, which was a source of income for Muslim rulers, as well as they served as scapegoats when needed. Following Muhammad's death in the year 632, followers in Arab tribes who were united under Islam exploded out in all directions to conquer lands for Allah. Within 30 years, under the 4 rightly guided caliphs, a caliph is a successor of both military and religious leader. Within 30 years, under these 4 rightly guided caliphs, they conquered the Persians and most of the Byzantine Empire. Muslims were in a state of perpetual struggle and striving, which is called jihad. Jihad does not mean holy war, it really means struggle and striving, because Allah wants Muslims to establish the Islamic faith in the entire world by conversion or by sword. Islam is to prevail over all religions, as is expressed in the Quran. Spilling Muslim blood, with some exceptions, is haram, which means forbidden. But spilling non Muslim blood is halal, which is considered acceptable. People of the book, which are the Christians and Jews, incurred the wrath of Allah, so some he transformed into apes and swine, those who worshipped evil. Rapidly conquered lands until, by the year 750, the map of Muslim controlled lands looked like this. We saw this map, I believe it was in part 1, perhaps it was part 2, and I'll just briefly reiterate. We see in the maroon portion essentially the entire Arabian Peninsula conquered by the Muslims. I have superimposed present day countries on this map so that everyone in today's world could see more clearly where they had spread. And then you'll see the orange color is where they spread north and east and west both. In the next under the next group of caliphs called the Rashidun caliphs. And then the third grouping, or actually the second grouping of caliphs, the Umayyad, they are the ones who conquered the area represented by the golden portions. And you'll see that continued to the east, a little bit north, and then also to the west and up into Europe, where they conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and Portugal sit. Just a brief reminder of some Islamic doctrines, that they believe they're a primordial religion, taqiyya, which is prevarication, lying, and then salam, peace, and Allah. Islam regards itself as a primordial religion from which Judaism and Christianity are subsequent developments. Abraham and all the biblical prophets were monotheistic Muslims. Taqiyya is the practice of lying under certain circumstances. It protects Muslims from persecution. It encourages them to lie to advance the cause of Islam, in some cases by gaining the trust of non-believers in order to draw out their vulnerability and defeat them. And then we have salam, which is peace. One interpretation is personal peace through complete submission to Allah, but another, and far more prevalent from my observation and my reading, is that peace occurs when all the world is in submission to Islam and therefore Allah. Islam means living in a peaceful environment that emerges as a result of submission to God. The Quran asks that all humanity embrace silm, that is peace, and avoid following Satan. This comes from an Islamic website and from Quran 2:208. As the Christian who is to emulate Jesus, who loved people, healed them physically and spiritually, the Muslim is to emulate Muhammad, whose last 10 years were spent forcibly converting many to Islam. And here's a quick slide showing you the two different sorts of peace. We have peace through complete submission to Allah, and then we have peace when the world submits to Allah, which, when that happens, will bring in peace according to Islam. Are Allah and the God of Christianity the same? Islam claims that Allah is the same God revealed in the Bible, yet his attributes are vastly different. Allah is a singular God versus the triune Christian God, which the Quran explicitly denies. Now, just a reminder, Christians believe in one God, but he has chosen to manifest himself in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Allah is unknowable versus the knowable Christian God, especially through Jesus Christ. The chief attribute of Allah is his transcendence, his requirement for total submission, versus the Christian God's love for his people and his grace and mercy. Allah deals with the world through his word, prophets, and angels, versus the Christian God who himself enters into history in the person of Jesus Christ. And then the bottom line is works versus grace, and do versus done. The biblical history of the rift between Muslims and Jews, and there's more detailed information on this in a handout if you choose to get them. This happens to be a picture of the Dome of the Rock. the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem in the Old City section. So the golden dome that you see so prominently on the right is the Dome of the Rock, with the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is to the far left in the same compound. It has it's partly off the picture. It's above the crenellated portion of the wall, and it has the in sort of the inlaid brick that have rounded archways with three windows inside each archway. The top one looking to me to be closed off, and the bottom one's looking to be open. I guess the bottom ones perhaps are doorways. The rift begins with Ishmael, the forefather of the Arabs. Ishmael is Abraham's firstborn son by the Egyptian Hagar. They are sent away when Ishmael is a young teen. Many of you will remember this story from Genesis. Sarah, Abraham's wife, conceives Isaac in her old age. God promised Ishmael, I will bless him. He will become the father of 12 princes, but my covenant I will establish with Isaac. Muslims and Jews believe Ishmael to be the forefather of the Arabs, the people group who founded Islam. Muslims believe Israelites were never God's chosen people, but rather Ishmael and his Arab descendants were cheated out of their inheritance because Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn. God's covenant with Abraham. In Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, God would make Abraham and his descendants a great nation, bless them, and bless those who bless them. Abraham is a spiritual father for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. God would curse those who curse Israel, whose mission was the redemption of the world through Jesus. That's from Genesis 12:3. And in Genesis, the promise of the covenant with God is made to Abraham. Chapter 15, verses 18 through 21, and chapter 17, verses 7 through 8, and then to Isaac in chapters 26 and 28, and then to Jacob in chapter 35, biblically sealing the fact that Isaac was the line of inheritance from God, not Ishmael. Now, we're obviously basing this information on the fact that as Christians, we believe that the Bible is wholly accurate in its original autographs, and it's providentially preserved down to today, and the good translations are very reliable, but we always want to go back to the original language to get, shades of meaning to be clear. Where the Muslims believe that our Bible has been very much corrupted, even though they do give lip service to the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah. Muslims believed that Jews falsified the original revelation and made themselves heirs, yet Galatians 4:21 to 5:1 confirms the Genesis account of Ishmael and Isaac, contrasting the former born of a bondwoman and of the flesh, and the latter born of a free woman and of promise. In verse 30, which is a quote from Genesis 21, it makes clear that Ishmael will not be an heir with Isaac. The unconditional covenant. God gave the land of Israel to Abraham and his descendants, establishing 1, to whom it is given, 2, its borders, 3, the duration of ownership, and then I give a number of verses to back up these points. Ishmael was given a promise from God also. He would make a great nation from him, again from Genesis, and again in chapter 21 of Genesis, when an angel from heaven called to Hagar and saved their lives, that is Hagar and Ishmael, and said that he would have 12 princes, and that comes from Genesis 17 and 25. And this is a map you've seen before, but we'll look at it again. This is the land given to Israel as described in Genesis 5:18 and 17:8. And you can see down below the guide as to how those borders were drawn on this map. Now, I will tell you, I have seen other maps that look somewhat different from this, and I don't really have an explanation. I did not delve into it strongly. But I do want to point out that you'll see to the left of the larger triangle, of tall, skinny triangle, and that is present-day Israel, is that small, skinny triangle. Quite different compared to the land that God originally gave them. This is a map given to us by a Bible teacher who's a former pastor in Florida, and it's very different looking. And I don't know why. I'm not able to answer this to you, but the main reason why I kept it in here is because if you look at the red section, it gives you a really clear vision of what present-day Israel looks like. It's a very tiny portion of the land that God gave them originally. The hatred of Jews as religious doctrine. Jerusalem, also called Al Quds, and you'll see that word from time to time. So if you see it, you know that's Jerusalem, was conquered in the year 638 by the Muslims. Now, keep in mind that Muhammad died in the year 632. So 6 years later, Muslims had made their way all the way to Jerusalem and had conquered it. They built a wooden mosque over the rock believed to be where Abraham attempted to sacrifice Isaac. The Al Aqsa Mosque is on this site, on the Jewish Temple Mount. And if you might remember the photograph that I showed you several slides ago, it was to the far left. And it's in the Old City. It's in the same compound as the Dome of the Rock, and that was to the right of that picture with the gold dome overhead, which is a Muslim shrine. And they developed a number of legends to codify this appropriation. I see slide 18, so you can always rewind this a bit if you want to take a look at that more carefully. Before Omar's death in 644, he conquered large parts of the Middle East, put Christendom on the defensive, and prepared the way for his successors to push into Spain, Sicily, Crete, Italy, and France, among other countries. Laws regarding non Muslims, dhimmis, were established. Dhimmis are especially Jews, but they're also Christians and pagans, and they're people who have been conquered by the Muslims and have allowed to live. They have to willingly submit to Islam, not convert to Islam, but to willingly submit to their Muslim leaders, is perhaps how I should put it. This dhimmi status served to enrich Islam and Muslims, and the reason was because they were required to pay a jizya tax that was something like 50% of what they earned. And from what I have read, it was really only the adult males that paid that tax, not every single individual. But it was an onerous tax, and of course, men, I'm sure, largely are the ones that brought in any wealth for the family. So these are some of the rules they lived under. Jews couldn't touch the Quran. They had to wear distinctive clothing with a yellow badge. Christians wore blue badges. They could not perform religious practices in public, nor own or ride a horse. They paid a confiscatory tax of at least 50%, it's called the jizya, I mentioned that a second ago. And Hitler adopted much of this. The Muslim push into Europe, and I have a handout with more details. We also covered this in, I believe it was part 2, only very briefly. This will be a little more detailed. In about 661, Islam had conquered the Persian Empire. Now, the Persian Empire is going to be to the east of the Arabian Peninsula, and most of the Byzantine Empire, the eastern portion of the Roman Empire, whose capital was Constantinople, which is present-day Istanbul, and was Christian. Warriors did not fear death. They were confident that Allah had destined them for victory, and there was much loot to gain. And if martyred, they would be rewarded with paradise. The Caliph retained 1/5 of the loot, including women and slaves. And slaves could be women or just used as sexual slaves. And you can see Hovsepian, pages 184 to 90, for a complete description of the pleasures awaiting men who died in jihad. Conquered peoples had 3 or 4 choices, which is still true today. They could denounce their religion and embrace Islam. They could pay the jizya tax with willing submission. They could accept dhimmi status. They could be executed. They could become a slave. This was not always on the list of choices, nor was it even really a choice. And through the centuries, often the young men would be conscripted into the fighting forces, and the women and children made slaves, and everyone else who did not convert killed. Clearly, different armies, different Muslim armies did different things. As time went on, they were not under one or two, well, I would want to say 2 major leaders, the Sunnis and the Shias, but they even split into smaller groups. And so you may have had, at the same time, a number of caliphs who were fighting jihad and weren't necessarily in sync with their fellow caliph in a country, some distance away. The Iberian Peninsula, remember this is where Spain and Portugal sit today. In 670, the Umayyad caliphs unsuccessfully attacked Constantinople, which is present-day Istanbul. Meanwhile, warriors swept across North Africa, defeated the Byzantines, and converted the Berber tribes, which became known as the Moors. In 711, a Muslim fleet of Moors landed on the Iberian Peninsula and conquered most of Iberia by 715. So in 4 years, they swept across that continent, not continent, excuse me, peninsula. According to Abdul Haq, as quoted in Geisler, the first century of Muslims gained such vast territory and wealth that it began to trouble them. In protest of the excesses of Islam, they took to wearing coarse cloth called suf. Hence, the Sufis were born out of this protest against worldliness. France. Following the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe was divided into many small kingdoms and smaller dukedoms who were at constant war with one another. Charles of the Kingdom of the Franks, they had been Christians for about 200 years, was a loose confederation of dukedoms. The Kingdom of the Franks, I should say, was a loose confederation of dukedoms. It comprises present-day France and part of Germany. They engaged in constant warfare and so had a formidable army. And my point in telling you this is Charles of the Kingdom of the Franks was well versed in warfare. The Muslims in Iberia crossed the Pyrenees north, raiding the Franks. In about 721, Charles' infantry defeated the Muslims near Tours in an epic battle. Their leader was killed. Raids across the Pyrenees stopped in 740. Charles was seen as a savior of Christendom. He was later given the name Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. His grandson Charlemagne, and everyone knows Charlemagne, finally unified most of Europe under his rule. The Muslims remained in Iberia another 700 years, greatly influencing Spain, and finally being expelled from Christian Spain in 1492, along with the Jews under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, well known to most Americans for having sent Columbus across the ocean blue in 1492. And then we have Vienna, which is in Austria. In the 11th century, popes and kings in Europe began the Crusades, a series of wars to retake Jerusalem and the surrounding Holy Land from Muslim control. They were successful for a time. They retained control for nearly 100 years, but they were eventually expelled by the Muslims. And one of the big points I want you to take away from the Crusades is that the lands that they reconquered were lands that had been Christian, maybe Christian and Jewish, with some pagans thrown in, I'm sure, but they had large Christian populations. The Muslims had come in and by the sword taken all the land. So the idea of the Crusades was to retake it for Christendom. I'm not supporting the Crusades. I'm just simply telling you what it is that basically happened. The Mongols captured Baghdad in 1258 and massacred the population. The caliphate was gone, but the Ottoman Turks, the Muslims, arose in what is now Turkey and pushed into Europe. In 1452, an Ottoman ruler captured Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and within about 100 years, the Ottomans had conquered Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, Romania, and Hungary. And you might remember, I believe it was in part 2, when I listed Eastern European countries that were majority Muslim. These countries that are listed here, several of these are majority Muslim today. In 1528 and again in 1566, the Ottoman Turks tried to capture Vienna, the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. Just as an aside here, the Holy Roman Empire was an attempt by the Pope to revive the Roman Empire, beginning with the Pope crowning Charlemagne and then successive emperors. And this is where we begin to get this very mixing of politics and the Roman Catholic Church. So back to the Ottoman Turks tried to capture Vienna, in the capital of the Holy Roman Empire in the heart of Europe, and they failed. About 100 years later, they laid siege to Vienna with 250,000 troops, and in 1683, a Polish military leader named Sobieski arrived with 60,000 Christian fighters, motivated them by declaring this a holy war. The Muslims fled, and the Ottomans' dream of taking Europe collapsed. How Europe could have been speaking Arabic when you think about the potentiality of the Moors that had come into the Iberian Peninsula and now the Ottoman Turks that had come into Vienna, near Vienna, I should say. The fall of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire gradually receded until the sultans in Istanbul, Old Constantinople, failed to reform the army to defend against the Europeans. This all occurred well before World War I. European countries occupied by Ottomans won independence, and those would be those Eastern Europeans countries we've talked about. In 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte conquered and ruled Egypt for a short while, beginning the European imperialism in the Muslim world. Russians went into Central Asia, threatening Persia, which is now Iran. The British took India and occupied Afghanistan. The Dutch colonized Indonesia. The French imposed colonial rule throughout North Africa, and the British took over Egypt in 1882. So we're seeing a colonization by the West of what had become Muslim territory. After World War I, having sided with Germany, the Ottoman Empire was divided up among the victorious European powers. The British occupied Iraq, and France took control of Syria. In 1921, Ataturk overthrew the last of the Ottomans and established the modern nation of Turkey, which is now swinging back to strong Muslim rule and away from secular government. So we're getting very close now to the present day time. This section is the Crusades, the defeat of the Ottoman Turks, and the state of Israel. And I have some information not only on this, which I've mentioned earlier, but I also have a handout about the old city of Jerusalem, which is kind of interesting because while it sits in the city of Jerusalem, which sits in the country of Israel, actually the Jordanians have a lot of control over it. It's very interesting. By the start of the Crusades, some caliphates, particularly those in North Africa, were weakened due to wealth and rich living. The dhimmis were paying the jizya to the caliphates, bringing in enormous riches, and the Sufis were formed to combat what they saw as decadent living and to emphasize spirituality in Islam. The Crusades officially occurred from 1095 to 1291, which is just shy of 200 years, which is when the Christians sought to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. They were finally defeated with the last Christian stronghold at Acre. In 1288, the Islamic Ottoman Empire formed by Uthman, the first Sultan of the Turks, and it grew over the next 6 centuries to be one of the largest and richest in history. The zenith of its power was from 1520 to 1586 under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. It included Greece, modern Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and the Balkans. They controlled the Mediterranean coast from Egypt to Morocco, the Sudan, which is in Africa, all of the Middle East, Syria, Persia, Afghanistan, and India. They destroyed state identities and boundaries of the Middle East for the last 4 centuries of their rule, and they were twice repelled from the gates of Vienna. I know a couple of these things are repetitive, but I don't think it hurts to have it more firmly planted in our minds. The Ottoman Empire began a slow, steady decline, drifting from Quranic dynatism to corrupt despotism. They enforced dhimmi laws against the Jews and Christians with great cruelty. The Holy Land suffered under the Ottoman Turks until by the late 19th century the land was barren, denuded, with much erosion. In the 1880s to about 1918, Jews returned to Palestine and they founded the first modern city of Tel Aviv. Arab populations benefited as earlier many had been forced into this barren land by Arab masters. Eventually, the Jews became victims of their own success in reclaiming the land as more and more Muslims were attracted to Palestine and revived the old tactic of using Jews as scapegoats. World War I, which was from 1914 to 18, the Jews from a number of countries aligned with the British at the risk of offending the Turks, fighting with the British in their armed forces. The Ottoman Empire was defeated in 1918 with a total collapse in 1920. It was partitioned among the Allies, as we've mentioned before, which freed the Jews from the oppression of dhimmi status. The British people began to understand a special relationship between Jews and their promised land following the Reformation. So all the way back during the Reformation, 1517 to 1648, the British people are beginning to understand this special relationship. So the ground had been set. I would say the Lord had prepared the ground it had been set for in 1917. We have the Balfour Declaration by Britain, which mandated the recreation of a Jewish state out of the defeated Ottoman Empire. In 1922, this is just 5 years later, the original land promised to the Jews included present day Israel and Jordan, and it was proved unanimously by the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations. Abdullah ibn Hussein, a direct descendant of Muhammad and the great grandfather to present day King Hussein, was kicked out of Saudi Arabia and desired to be granted Jordan, sometimes called Transjordan. We know the country of Jordan today. This was granted to him, leaving huge swaths of land under Muslim control and a tiny slice for the Jews. So, very quickly after this original Balfour Declaration for the recreation of the Jewish state, and they originally had a fairly large piece of land, coming close to what God had promised the Jews in Genesis. Um, Very quickly, when Abdullah ibn Hussein came along and said, "No, I would like the land that we now call Jordan, which is a huge portion of this land set aside for the Jews," it was granted to him. The White Papers of 1938 to 39, it sometimes is spoken of in the singular, but it's a number of papers, stated that what was to be a Jewish state would now be jointly Arab and Jewish. Britain enacted harsher restrictions of Jews with regard to immigration. Now recognize that World War II is just about to start. 1939 is the official start date of World War II. And what you may or may not know is the 1930s were a very difficult time in Germany and some surrounding countries for the Jews because Hitler had already risen to power. So the British enacted harsher restrictions of Jews who wanted to get out of Germany. During Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s, immigration into Palestine was severely limited on through World War II, 1939 to 45. The United States of America took very few Jews in, as it was overtly anti Semitic until perhaps the 1970s. Not that anti Semitism is dead today, it is not, but it was very overtly anti Semitic until perhaps that time frame. At the end of World War II in 1945, 6 million Jews had been murdered, and only 51,000 were permitted to immigrate to Palestine. In 1948, a newfound militancy of Jews succeeded in accomplishing the rebirth of Israel, whereupon they were immediately and unsuccessfully attacked by the surrounding Muslim nations. This is called the First Arab-Israeli War. I would so encourage you to look up this war and read the unbelievable miracles that occurred, that this newly founded, very tiny little Jewish land was set upon by, I believe it was 5 or 6, I don't remember the exact number, of Arab nations that completely surrounded it except for a little bit of the Mediterranean and were repelled is an amazing, amazing act of God. So this will conclude part 3, and part 4 will be our absolute conclusion to our series on Islam. We're going to talk about the politicalization of Islam. We're going to talk about jihad featuring an online ISIS magazine that I've promised you for a couple of episodes now. We're going to talk about the Barbary pirates and their impact on the United States. This is a little known piece of American history that most people, I think, will be very surprised about. I know the 2 times that I spoke in public, I'm doing this from my home. The 2 times that I spoke publicly on this, hardly anyone was aware of this history. Then the Ummah Wahadi was the one nation concept, which is, again, very interesting. It's going to tie into Muslims in the United States today. We're going to go over the evangelization of Muslims, again, as a review. And I've got some random thoughts of discussion, and I'm going to end with a true story by Jenny Hovsepian that you don't want to miss. She's the author of 2 Great Men Who Changed Our World Forever, another book that I would highly recommend. Once again, if you're interested in any of the handouts, just email this email address. You don't need to tell me what it is you'd like to have. I will send every single one that I have referenced, including my bibliography, in PDF form, and it will have embedded links, so you can just click and you can go to the link. And then this is the bibliography, and as I said in parts 1 and 2, if it's in bold, I particularly recommend it. Thank you once again for joining me for part 3. I do hope you come back for part 4. I think the online ISIS magazine will be of particular interest, but I would like to think that you will really gain a lot of knowledge about Islam, about the geopolitical situation of today regarding Islam and the Muslims. And I pray that you will find it in your heart to love Muslims deeply, pray for them often, and be willing to share Jesus Christ with them. God bless to each and every one of you.